Senator Simons.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. There is a great old-fashioned English expression that I don't think we use enough anymore, to set a cat amongst the pigeons. And that, of course, is exactly what our colleague Senator Harder has done with his timely and provocative motion. In an era in which provincial governments are invoking the notwithstanding clause more and more casually, without seeming to see any political hazard or consequence, in an era in which at least one federal leader has mused about invoking the clause preemptively to charter-proof future legislation, it's a fair question for senators to ask themselves, should we preemptively attest that we will not pass federal legislation that preemptively invokes the clause in such a way? Well, I shan't keep you in suspense. Much though I applaud Senator Harder for asking this vexing question, and much though I deplore and denounce the cavalier way in which we have seen provinces weaponize the notwithstanding clause to strip fundamental civil rights away from everyone from trans teenagers to Muslim school teachers, I think we should be quite cautious about vowing not to pass any bills that invoke the clause, because there may come a day or time when a government may have a legitimate public policy need to deke around a potentially problematic court decision. We need only look across the border to see what happens when a Supreme Court loses its moral bearings and starts to dishonor the constitutional rights it is meant to protect. The notwithstanding clause is, after all, constitutional because it is part and parcel of the Constitution itself. But with apologies, my speech isn't over quite yet, because it is imperative that we have a hard and honest conversation about why we have a notwithstanding clause at all and why it is being used so broadly and brutally these days. And to understand that question, we need to go back in time. In 1971, the newly elected Peter Lougheed, the young reforming Premier of Alberta, decided that he wanted the very first bill he introduced in the Alberta legislature to be an Alberta Bill of Rights. Alberta was the first province in the nation to have a Bill of Rights. And for Alberta, waking from the thrall of almost 4 decades of sociocratic government into a modern age, Bill 1 was to be a beacon, a sign of the province Premier Lougheed wanted to create. And so he asked his new Attorney General, Merv Leach, to draw up just such a bill. In a speech he gave 20 years later to the Centre for Constitutional Studies in Edmonton, Lougheed explained that Merv Leach came to him with a dilemma. Quote, he came to my office and described his progress in preparing Bill 1, the Alberta Bill of Rights. Merv said to me, Premier, we will have to provide this bill with a notwithstanding clause. I responded, what the hell is a notwithstanding clause? Merv patiently explained to me, something he had to do on a number of occasions, that we needed to include the clause which allowed, if public policy dictated, for other Alberta laws to operate notwithstanding the Alberta Bill of Rights, end quote. As Lougheed told the story, Leach patterned Alberta's notwithstanding clause on a similar clause written into the Canadian Bill of Rights, which had been passed by the Diefenbaker government in 1960. And so Alberta's Bill of Rights was introduced in the spring of 1972 with a notwithstanding clause protecting the primacy of the elected legislature. A decade later, in the heat of debate over the patriation of Canada's Constitution and the drafting of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Alberta's model of the notwithstanding clause helped to broker the compromise that made the Charter a reality. And yet, by 1991, Peter Lougheed himself was having some misgivings about the ease with which some provinces were invoking the clause. In this same speech, Lougheed said that while he still supported the clause, he would have liked to have seen a higher bar to invoking it. Quote, a simple majority does not appear adequate for Parliament or a provincial legislature to introduce legislation including a notwithstanding clause, Lougheed told his audience. It is too substantive an action by the elected body and hence requires a higher level of authorization than a simple majority. Lougheed's suggestion? Amend the Constitution to require any federal or provincial government who invoked the override clause to win a vote of at least 60% of MPs or MLAs. For better or worse, of course, that never happened. Peter Lougheed himself never did invoke the notwithstanding clause as Premier. But in March of 1998, the government of Alberta's then Premier Ralph Klein did just that. You may remember that I spoke recently in this chamber about the atrocities committed by the Alberta Eugenics Board under the terms of Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act. One of those people who had been sterilized without her knowledge or consent was a young girl named Leilani Muir. Years later, as an adult, Muir sued the province, and she won. She was awarded a judgment of more than $740,000 plus costs. In an effort to head off more lawsuits and save millions, the Klein government preemptively invoked the notwithstanding clause to stop other victims from suing and introduced a new law intended to cap damages at $150,000 per person. The public outcry was instantaneous and led, if I may say, by my own newspaper of the day, the Edmonton Journal, which rained down fire and brimstone on its editorial pages. Less than 24 hours later, the province backed down, and Ralph Klein personally apologized. Quote, "This was presented to caucus in pure legal technical terms, and yes, my political sense probably didn't click into gear," Premier Klein told reporters. "It became abundantly clear," he added, "that to individuals in this country, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is paramount, and the use of any tool to undermine the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is something that should be used in only very, very rare circumstances." That's the end of Premier Klein's quote. Just 3 weeks later, in April of 1998, the Supreme Court of Canada brought down its landmark Vreen decision, which established LGBTQ rights in Canada by reading in protection from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation to both Alberta's Individual Rights Protection Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in the wake of the Vreen decision, Ralph Klein came under immense pressure from some in his party and in the province to invoke the notwithstanding clause. But in the end, he pushed back against the social conservative voices in his own caucus. He refused to invoke the clause, in no small part because of the backlash he'd experienced when he tried to use the clause to take away the rights of those who'd been sexually sterilized. Ralph Klein was no constitutional scholar, but he was one canny politician, and he judged that the political risks of invoking the clause were just too great. And so in Alberta, the notwithstanding clause worked just the way it was supposed to. It gave Ralph Klein, the democratically elected premier, the final political decision. He could have used the clause to veto the Vreen ruling, but he made a fundamental political decision not to invoke the clause. And the legislation remained supreme, just as Merv Leach and Peter Lougheed had hoped. But only because decent, fair-minded Albertans made it clear that they would not accept the use of the clause to strip vulnerable citizens of their rights. In the end, we didn't just rely on Ralph Klein's political instincts or his sometimes wavering moral compass. We relied on the ethical judgment of Albertans who weren't afraid to speak out. Well, I ask, are the Albertans and the Canadians of 2024 any less decent and fair-minded? Are they any less brave? I hope not. I just don't think we're paying as much attention. Back in 1998, pretty much every person in Alberta knew about the legal threats to use the notwithstanding clause against sexual sterilization victims and gays and lesbians. These were the biggest news stories of the year, covered by every newspaper and broadcast outlet. Everyone was talking about these issues. The whole province was engaged in the debate. In the last few years, though, when premiers and provinces have invoked the clause, there has been, primarily, silence. It's disturbing, but I don't think it can simply be written off as apathy or tacit acceptance. Newspapers and newscasts simply don't have the same weight and power they did a quarter century ago. We have only a tiny fraction of the reporters and editorialists that we once did. And with digital disruptions at every turn, far fewer people are reading newspapers or watching the national news. It doesn't help that thanks to Bill C-18, vectors where people once saw and shared news, such as Facebook and Instagram, are no longer places to see the headlines or discuss the stories of the day. Meanwhile, the social media ecosystem itself has fractured into so many tiny splinters. Once, when we talked about issues or memes going viral on Twitter or TikTok, we were talking about things that really spread. Now it's much more difficult to spread any kind of message to a broad general audience, especially if it's truth. Today's media consumers are divided, not connected by their media channels. Once, everyone in a community was sharing the same information at the same time and reacting to it in concert, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And Canadians have never been more distracted by the latest news about Donald Trump or Taylor Swift, or focused perhaps on what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza or Tigray province, or simply preoccupied dealing with the daily challenges of feeding their families, making their mortgage payments, or finding a doctor. If they follow national or provincial news at all, they probably see headlines about elections, not think pieces about constitutional conventions. Small wonder today's political leaders think they can get away with invoking the clause without backlash. It's because they've already seen that they can. And if the citizens aren't doing their job of holding their elected officials accountable, if our political culture is this badly broken, and I think after this week's events in the United States, that is a fair question, How dangerous has the clause now become? Once politicians feared to invoke it because of a sense of shame. But in a political culture without honor, the clause has taken on a new and more sinister dimension because the democratic guardrails are gone. And yet, in the midst of this muddle, our role in this chamber has never been more clear. We are here to protect the Constitution and the Charter, to protect the civil rights and the equality rights of all Canadians, to protect the right to a fair and timely trial, to protect the right to strike, to protect freedom of religion, to protect the right to abortion and to complete reproductive health, to protect trans youth from state bullying. If and when bills come before us that are prima facie unconstitutional, bills that clearly strip Canadians of their established charter rights, we should feel empowered to delay, amend, or, when necessary, defeat them, even if the party were to run and win on a platform of denying charter rights. I respect the legacy of the Salisbury Convention, and if a government runs on a platform and is elected with a popular mandate, then we, as an appointed chamber, traditionally and correctly show deference to the bills that flow from that mandate. But this is not the United Kingdom. This is a federation with a written constitution and a charter of rights and freedoms. And while we must show appropriate deference to the other place, which is elected and accountable to voters, we must also at the same time be prepared to defend our Constitution, to stand up for minority rights and regional rights and the rights of us all. Not because we are radicals or revolutionaries, but because we are the guardians and the conservators of the law. Because this chamber exists to be conservative in the very best sense of the word. Carved above the office of the Speaker of the Senate in the old center block is this quotation from the Roman poet Horace: Sapere ode, dare to be prudent, or as it's translated by others, dare to be wise. Dare to use your own reason. In any translation, it is an excellent motto for this fraught era and for this independent Senate. So let us not tie our hands and take pledges that may someday backfire against us. Let us respect the legacy and the proper purpose of the notwithstanding clause, which is a part of our Constitution and a part of our history. But let us always be courageous in prudently protecting the rights of all Canadians. Thank you, merci, and hi-hi.